Seize the cash, count it, and turn it in. On the inside, it's different.
We had a Crime Stopper.
$1 million in this bucket. I bought 14 more of those things. That's a $20 million rip. You gotta be smart right now. You gotta move this money, man.
Stay off the radio.
Just this. Everything.
You heard about the inside heist teams.
Yeah, cops playing robbers.
Need any help tonight, Lieutenant?
Nope. We didn't get a heads up about this.
The longer we stay here, the dice who we talk to matters.
You see that?
P-I-G-S.
You have 30 minutes to get out of that house.
Is there anything that you've heard about him?
There's snitches in every division.
Watch your back.
Cover! Bitch! I'm breaking left! I got the roof!
You want to steal this rip? Just say it out loud.
You a snitch, Mike?
First off, back the fuck up.
Before this goes really bad for all of us.
What if a group of police officers found millions of dollars hidden inside a house, and for the first time in their careers, the biggest danger was not the criminals outside the door, but the people standing beside them? That is the question sitting at the heart of The Rip, the 2026 crime thriller starring Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Steven Yeun, Teyana Taylor, Sasha Calle, Catalina Sandino Moreno, Kyle Chandler, and Scott Adkins. On paper, it sounds like another police action movie. A team enters a stash house, they discover an unbelievable amount of money, they secure the evidence, the criminals come looking for it, gunfights happen, people start lying. But The Rip becomes much more interesting when you realize that the money is not really the main villain. The real villain is temptation, because when millions of dollars suddenly appear in front of people who have spent years dealing with criminals, pressure, danger, politics, and the grey areas of police work, the question is no longer simply who owns this money. The much darker question becomes who can resist taking it. And that is where Matt Damon and Ben Affleck's reunion becomes especially important. These two actors have been connected for decades. They became famous together after Good Will Hunting, a movie they wrote together and starred in, and their friendship eventually became one of Hollywood's most recognizable creative partnerships. Years later, they returned to the same screen for The Rip, but this time they are not playing young friends chasing dreams. They are playing experienced police officers whose professional relationship is slowly placed under extreme pressure. The movie was directed and written by Joe Carnahan, a filmmaker who has spent much of his career working with crime, violence, morally complicated characters, and fast-moving action. His filmography includes movies such as Narc and Smoking Aces, so The Rip fits naturally into the kind of world he likes to explore. Carnahan developed the story with Michael McGrail, and the film was produced through Artist Equity, the company founded by Damon and Affleck. Netflix ultimately became the home of the film, and The Rip was released globally on January 16, 2026. But before we talk about whether the movie works, it is worth understanding where the idea came from. The story was inspired in part by a real-life experience involving Miami-Dade Police Captain Chris Cassiano. According to the filmmakers, the inspiration came from an actual police situation involving a major cash discovery. In 2016, Cassiano and members of a Miami-Dade narcotics squad were involved in a raid that uncovered roughly $20 million hidden inside a Miami Lakes residence. Imagine being one of the officers who opens a door expecting drugs, weapons, or another dangerous criminal setup and instead discovers stacks and stacks of cash. That kind of discovery would change the atmosphere of any police operation instantly. Money has a strange power in crime stories. Drugs can be destroyed, weapons can be confiscated, a criminal can be arrested, but cash is different. Cash represents freedom, comfort, power, and a completely different life. And when the amount becomes millions of dollars, the temptation becomes almost impossible to ignore. Carnahan used that basic idea and transformed it into a fictional thriller about trust breaking down inside a police team. The title itself comes from Miami police slang. According to Carnahan, a rip refers to taking the possessions of a criminal during a seizure. In other words, when police confiscate cash, drugs, or weapons from a criminal operation, that confiscation can be described as a rip. That small detail makes the title much smarter than it first appears. At first, The Rip sounds like the name of a robbery movie, but the title is actually connected to the language of the police officers themselves, and eventually the movie starts making us wonder whether the line between a legal seizure and an illegal theft is becoming dangerously thin. The first major attraction of the movie was obviously its cast. Matt Damon plays Lieutenant Dane Dumas, the leader of the tactical narcotics group. Ben Affleck plays Detective Sergeant J.D. Byrne, Dumas' partner and another veteran officer. Stephen Yeun plays Detective Mike Rowe, Tiana Taylor plays Detective Numa Baptiste, Catalina Sandino Morion plays Detective Loso Salazar, Sasha Calle plays Desiree Daisy Lopez Molina, while Kyle Chandler plays DEA agent Mateo Matinix. Scott Adkins is also part of the ensemble. This is one of those casts where almost every name brings a different audience into the movie. Matt Damon gives the film its serious leading man presence. Ben Affleck brings a harder, more weathered quality. Stephen Yeun brings emotional subtlety. Teyana Taylor adds another layer of intensity to the police team. Kyle Chandler is perfect for the kind of authority figure who can walk into a room and immediately change the temperature. And Scott Adkins gives action fans another reason to pay attention. But the most interesting pairing is still Damon and Affleck. Their history gives their scenes an extra layer that the script does not always need to explain. When two actors have known each other for decades, audiences naturally bring their real world history into the theater, or in this case, into the living room. That is especially useful for The Rip because the movie is fundamentally about relationships. Dumas and Byrne have history. They know each other's habits, they know each other's weaknesses, they know how the other person thinks, they have spent years working together. And that is exactly why their relationship becomes dangerous when the money appears. If two strangers begin accusing each other of corruption, the accusation is easy to dismiss. But when a longtime partner starts looking at you differently, everything changes. A glance suddenly means something, a delayed answer becomes suspicious. A phone call that lasts too long becomes suspicious. A missing piece of information becomes suspicious. Even silence becomes suspicious. That is one of the movie's strongest ideas. The Rip understands that paranoia does not need to arrive with a gun. Sometimes paranoia begins with a question. Why didn't you tell me? Where were you? Who else knows? How much money did we actually find? Why are you asking? And suddenly the entire team is looking at one another differently. The movie's development was announced in 2024 with Damon and Affleck attached to star and produce. Carnahan was attached as writer and director while Michael McGrail was involved in the story. Artist Equity became the production company behind the project with Damon and Affleck producing alongside Danny Bernfeld and Luciana Damon. Netflix eventually acquired the film for distribution. The Artist Equity connection is particularly interesting because the production reportedly involved an unusual performance-based arrangement for crew members. The company negotiated a deal under which approximately 1,200 people who worked on the production could receive a bonus if the movie reached certain performance benchmarks on Netflix during its first 90 days. That is interesting because streaming movies normally operate differently from traditional theatrical releases. When a movie opens in theaters, everyone can immediately see the box office numbers. You can look at the opening weekend. You can compare Monday's numbers with Friday's. You can calculate domestic and international totals. You can see whether the movie crossed $100 million, $200 million, or even $1 billion. Netflix does not traditionally give audiences that same kind of simple box office scoreboard. That means a movie like The Rip creates a strange situation. People can watch it, people can talk about it, people can argue about it. But the traditional question of how much did it make does not work in exactly the same way. The film was made for a reported budget around the $100 million range, but because it was released as a Netflix streaming title rather than a conventional worldwide theatrical release, there is no normal theatrical box office total to analyze. That does not mean the movie failed commercially. It means its commercial success has to be understood differently. For Netflix, viewer engagement, completion rates, audience reach, and performance within the platform are much more important than a traditional box office number. And that becomes one of the most fascinating things about The Rip. This is a movie with the cast, budget, action, and filmmaking style of something that could easily have been marketed as a major theatrical crime thriller. Instead, audiences received it at home. There is something almost ironic about that. The movie is about people staring at millions of dollars and wondering who will take it. Meanwhile, the movie itself represents a modern Hollywood business model where the biggest question is no longer simply how much money a film makes at the box office. The question is how many people watch it. The movie was shot as a gritty crime thriller rather than a glossy superhero style action spectacle. Cinematographer Juan Miguel Aspiros worked with Kanahan to create a visual world that feels tense, enclosed, and dangerous. That visual approach is important because the movie's first half depends heavily on pressure rather than non stop action. The filmmakers do not need explosions every 5 minutes, they need people looking at each other. They need uncomfortable conversations. They need small moments that make the audience think something is wrong. Then, when the action finally arrives, it has more impact because the movie has spent time creating uncertainty. That structure is one reason the film can feel different from a standard police shootout movie. The story starts with a familiar setup. A police team discovers a stash house. Inside is a huge amount of cash. The officers have done their jobs. The money should become evidence, the operation should be finished. But instead, the discovery creates a chain reaction. The more people learn about the money, the more dangerous the situation becomes. The police are no longer dealing with one threat. They are dealing with multiple threats at once. There are criminals who want their money back. There are authorities who want answers. There are officers who have their own problems. And there is the possibility that someone inside the team may not be completely honest. That last possibility is what gives the movie its psychological tension. A good crime thriller makes you ask who the criminal is. A better one makes you ask whether the criminal is actually the person you think it is. The Rip tries to go one step further. It asks whether a good person can become a criminal when the right opportunity appears. That is a much more uncomfortable question because most people like to believe they know what they would do. If somebody asked you before watching the movie whether you would steal millions of dollars, the answer would probably be easy. No. Of course not, but imagine the situation differently. Imagine you are tired. Imagine you have financial problems. Imagine you have children. Imagine nobody is watching. Imagine the criminals who own the money are already dead or missing. Imagine there are millions sitting inside an abandoned house. Imagine everyone around you is asking the same question. What if? That is where morality becomes complicated, and that is where The Rip gets its title in a deeper sense. The movie is not just about ripping money away from criminals, it is about ripping apart trust. The team begins as a unit. By the end, the question is whether that unit can survive. Matt Damon is particularly effective because Doomers is not written as an exaggerated action hero. He is a police officer who has responsibility, he has authority. But authority can become a burden when everyone under you starts questioning your decisions. Doomer's position also creates an interesting conflict with Byrne. For years, the two men have been peers. Then one becomes the boss. That changes everything. Affleck himself explained that Byrne and Dumars had been peers throughout their careers, and that the new leadership structure created tension because people who are used to working as equals do not always adapt easily when one suddenly becomes the other's superior. That is a very believable workplace conflict. It also makes the movie's central tension stronger. The problem is not simply that one man is greedy, the problem is that the entire structure of the team has already changed before the money even arrives. There is a new boss. There are old relationships, there are different loyalties, and then millions of dollars enter the equation. That is basically gasoline being poured onto an already burning fire. Steven Yeun's role adds another interesting dimension to the group because his character is part of the same dangerous environment without being defined simply by the Damon Affleck conflict. Yoon has become known for characters who can communicate a lot through very small reactions, and that skill is useful in a movie where facial expressions sometimes matter almost as much as dialogue. Teyana Taylor also brings an important presence to the ensemble. Her performance helps make the police team feel like a group rather than simply a collection of famous actors standing behind Damon and Affleck. This matters because ensemble crime movies can easily become unbalanced. If the story focuses too much on the two biggest stars, everyone else becomes background decoration. The Rip attempts to avoid that. The team itself is the main character. The movie wants us to believe that these people have spent years working together, they have shared danger, they have shared jokes, they have probably saved each other's lives, they know each other's families, they know each other's personalities. And now they are trapped in a situation where every relationship can be questioned. That makes the money almost like a psychological weapon. Nobody has to point a gun at someone immediately, the possibility of betrayal is enough. One of the film's smartest choices is also the way it uses Miami. Miami is an obvious location for a crime thriller. It has beaches, nightlife, wealth, drugs, organized crime, police operations, and a visual identity that audience immediately recognize. But Carnahan does not treat Miami simply as a beautiful postcard. The city becomes part of the tension. The bright Florida atmosphere can contrast with the dark behavior of the characters. That contrast makes the story feel more unsettling. A city associated with sunshine and luxury becomes the background for paranoia, violence, and greed. The stash house itself is especially important. A rundown building filled with millions of dollars is almost a perfect visual metaphor. On the outside, it looks worthless. Inside, it contains enough money to change everyone's life. That is basically the entire movie in one image. Appearances mean nothing. You cannot judge what is inside a person by what they look like from the outside, and you cannot assume that because someone wears a badge, they are immune to temptation. This is one of the reasons the movie feels connected to classic 1970s police thrillers. Carnahan has openly talked about his love for films such as Serpico and Prince of the City along with Michael Mann's Heat. Those influences are important because those movies were often less interested in simple heroes and villains. They were interested in systems, they were interested in police officers who had to navigate morality. They were interested in friendships damaged by professional pressure. They were interested in the question of where law enforcement ends and personal ambition begins. The Rip takes that tradition and places it inside the modern Netflix action thriller machine. That combination can be both its strengths and its weakness. On one hand, the movie has the seriousness of an old school crime film. On the other hand, it has the pacing and visual polish expected from a modern streaming thriller. The result is a movie that feels familiar but still entertaining. And that brings us to the action. If you came to The Rip expecting a slow police drama with no violence, you may be surprised. The movie eventually becomes much more aggressive. The tension that begins inside conversations eventually explodes into physical danger. The second half becomes more action heavy, and this change in pace is one of the things critics noticed when discussing the film. Some viewers enjoyed the escalation because the earlier tension makes the action feel earned. Others felt that the later action sequences could become somewhat excessive compared with the tighter first half. That difference of opinion is important because The Rip is really two movies working together. The first movie is a tense police drama about trust. The second movie is a violent crime thriller about survival. When those two sides work together, the film is extremely effective. When they do not, the movie can feel like it is switching genres halfway through. But perhaps that is exactly what Carnahan wanted. Trust is fragile, so is control. The team thinks it understands the situation, then the situation changes. They think they know who they can trust, then something happens. They think they have control of the money, then someone else enters the equation. The movie repeatedly takes away certainty. That is the engine of the story. The screenplay is not trying to reinvent the police thriller, it is taking familiar pieces and rearranging them around one central question: what happens when temptation enters a group that is already under pressure? That question gives the film enough material to sustain its runtime. The movie runs for roughly 112 to 113 depending on the listing, which is actually a good length for this kind of thriller. It does not need to become a 3-hour epic. There is no reason to spend an hour explaining every character's childhood. The story is about one dangerous situation getting worse. The longer the money remains in the center of the story, the more pressure it creates. And the closer the characters get to the truth, the more dangerous their relationships become. The music also plays an important role. Composer Clinton Shorter created the original score for the film. Shorter is experienced with action and genre filmmaking, and his score for The Rip works best when it does not scream for attention. Crime thrillers often make the mistake of using music to tell audiences exactly how to feel. A character walks into a room, the music says, "Be scared." Someone picks up a gun, the music says, "This is dangerous." Someone lies, the music says, "They are lying." But subtle scoring can be much more effective. In The Rip, the music helps create a feeling that something is slowly becoming unstable. The score can make ordinary conversations feel dangerous. A quiet room can feel more threatening than a shootout. That is exactly what a good thriller score should do. It should make the audience nervous without explaining why. The film's sound design also matters during the action. Gunfire in a crime movie needs weight, cars need to sound dangerous, doors slamming need to feel like events. Footsteps in an empty building need to create anticipation. The best action scenes are not just visual, they are physical. You should almost feel like you are inside the room. That sense of physical danger helps the movie during its more intense sequences. And then there is the humor. One of the interesting things about movies like The Rip is that audiences often turn serious scenes into memes. Matt Damon and Ben Affleck already have a long history together, so viewers naturally started playing with the idea of the two longtime friends suddenly becoming suspicious of each other. The internet practically writes the memes by itself. After 40 years of friendship, $20 million was enough to test the friendship. Bro said, "Trust me, me and my friend after finding $20 million. Your coworker says the money is going into evidence." And one of the easiest jokes practically writes itself. Matt Damon and Ben Affleck finding millions of dollars and discovering that friendship suddenly has a price tag. That kind of humor does not necessarily hurt the movie. In fact, it can help a thriller become more memorable. People share serious scenes as jokes. Then their friends become curious. Then those people watch the movie. That is how a streaming movie can develop a second life online. There is also a funny meta layer to Damon and Affleck appearing together again. Their careers have taken very different paths. They started as young writers and actors who suddenly became Hollywood stars. They experienced enormous success. They had career highs, they had career disappointments, they became producers, they became directors, and eventually they created artist equity together. So when audiences see them working together again, it is not simply another casting decision. It feels like another chapter in a very long Hollywood friendship. That history gives The Rip a kind of built in curiosity. People who might not normally watch a police thriller may click because they want to see Damon and Affleck together again. And people who already love crime movies have another reason to watch. That is a very smart combination. The film's release strategy also helped it reach a global audience quickly. Instead of spending months moving through different theatrical markets, Netflix made the movie available globally on January 16, 2026. That means audiences around the world could watch the same movie at roughly the same time. It also means spoilers became a major issue. A movie built around secrets and trust can be ruined by one social media post, one screenshot, one TikTok caption, one YouTube thumbnail, one comment saying, "Wait until you see what happens to." That is why The Rip works best when you go into it knowing as little as possible. The basic setup is enough. Miami police, millions of dollars, a stash house, a team, a problem, trust begins to collapse. That is all you really need to know. because the fun is watching the characters discover the consequences themselves. And that is also why this movie works well for a movie explanation or movie review video. There are several layers to discuss. The obvious layer is the action. The second layer is the mystery. The third layer is the relationship between Damon and Affleck. The fourth layer is the morality of the police team. And the fifth layer is the larger question of whether money actually changes people or simply reveals who they already were. That last question is probably the most interesting. Does the money corrupt the characters? Or does the money simply expose corruption that was already there? That is a completely different thing. If a good person suddenly steals millions because they have the opportunity, we might say the money changed them. But what if they were already capable of doing it? What if the only thing missing was the opportunity? Crime stories have explored this question for decades, but the Rip gives it a particularly simple form. Put a huge amount of money in front of people, remove the normal consequences, add pressure, then watch what happens. It is almost like a psychological experiment. And that is why the stash house is more than a location. It is the laboratory of the movie. Every character enters it carrying their own history, their own problems, their own ambitions, their own secrets. Then the money sits there waiting. The longer they remain around it, the harder it becomes to pretend that it does not matter. That is the movie's central psychological trick. Nobody needs to say, I want the money. The audience can see it in the way people behave. A character who suddenly becomes defensive. Someone who asks too many questions, someone who wants to control the evidence, someone who does not trust another officer, someone who starts thinking about what could happen if the money disappeared. Those details build the tension. And once you understand that, The Rip becomes more than a simple cops and robbers movie. It becomes a movie about human weakness. The critics were generally positive, though not overwhelmingly so. Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus describes the film as using the established chemistry of Damon and Affleck while turning their friendship into part of a story about greed and trust. Metacritic's reported score was in the generally favorable range, while some reviewers praised its performances and tension but criticized elements of its formula and action heavy second half. That is probably the fairest way to describe the movie. It is not trying to become the next Heat. It is not replacing the classics, it is not reinventing the crime genre, but it is a confident, entertaining thriller with a strong cast and a simple premise that creates plenty of room for tension. And sometimes that is exactly what audiences want. Not every movie needs to change cinema. Sometimes you just want to press play on a Friday night and watch a group of complicated people make increasingly terrible decisions. The Rip understands that its biggest strength is the combination of simplicity and tension. Millions of dollars, a group of cops, one location, a growing sense that somebody cannot be trusted. That is a powerful setup. Its biggest weakness is that the movie occasionally leans into familiar crime thriller territory. Some plot developments feel recognizable, some characters fit familiar genre types. Some action scenes feel like they belong to a movie we have already seen, but the cast helps compensate for that. Good actors can make familiar material feel fresh. Damon can make a simple line sound important. Affleck can communicate frustration without saying much. Yeun can create uncertainty through small reactions. Taylor can bring intensity to a scene. Chandler can make authority feel threatening without needing to shout. That is why casting matters so much here. The movie depends on the audience believing these people have history together. If the cast had been weaker, the entire story could have felt artificial. Instead, the performances give it enough weight. And Matt Damon and Ben Affleck are clearly the emotional center. Their characters are not simply enemies. They are people who have worked together for years. That makes every disagreement more painful. Because betrayal is always more powerful when it comes from someone you trusted. That is the real horror of The Rip. Not the guns, not the criminals, not even the millions of dollars. It is the possibility that the person standing next to you may no longer be the person you thought they were. And once that thought enters your mind, there is no easy way to remove it. That is why the title becomes more meaningful by the end. The movie begins with a rip involving criminals, but as the story develops, it feels like the entire group is being ripped apart. Their loyalty, their friendship, their confidence, their professional identity, their understanding of each other. Everything starts coming apart, and money is the force pulling the threads. For a movie released directly to a streaming platform, The Rip also benefits from being easy to watch. You do not need to understand a huge franchise. You do not need to watch 5 previous movies. There is no superhero universe. There are no complicated rules. There is no 10-year cinematic timeline. You press play, meet the characters, and enter the situation. That accessibility is one of Netflix's greatest advantages. The movie can reach people who would never spend money on a theatrical ticket for a crime thriller. Someone scrolling through Netflix sees Matt Damon, then Ben Affleck. Then the words millions in cash. Then trust nobody. That is a strong pitch. And the trailer strategy clearly leaned into that idea. The official Netflix listing presents the film as a gritty, suspenseful action thriller built around a Miami police team and a huge cash discovery. The marketing does not need to explain everything, the premise sells itself. Imagine discovering millions. Now imagine having to transport it. Now imagine realizing someone wants to steal it. Now imagine realizing the person you are working with might be the thief. That is enough. The best movie hooks are often simple, and The Rip has one of those hooks. There is another interesting detail that deserves attention. The movie is rated R because of violence and pervasive language. That rating matters because it tells you what kind of crime thriller this is. The film is not trying to turn the police into cartoon heroes. It wants the world to feel rough. People swear, people fight, people make bad choices. Violence has consequences. The characters are not protected by the clean rules of a family action movie. That helps create the darker atmosphere. And it also fits Carnahan's filmmaking style. He has always been comfortable with characters who live in morally complicated worlds. There is rarely a perfectly clean line between right and wrong. That is exactly where The Rip lives. The movie asks you to judge people, but then it gives you reasons not to judge them too quickly. You think someone is suspicious, then you learn something else. You trust someone, then you see something strange. You believe one explanation, then another possibility appears. This constant movement keeps the movie alive. It is not necessarily a puzzle where every answer is completely unpredictable. Instead, it is a pressure cooker. You know something is going to explode. The fun is waiting to see when and who will be standing closest when it happens. That is why the movie can be described as a character thriller disguised as a police action movie. The action gets your attention. The characters keep you watching, the money gives the story its engine, the mistrust gives it its soul, and the Damon Affleck relationship gives it its emotional center. When you put all of those pieces together, you get a movie that may not become one of the defining crime films of the decade, but it can still be a very enjoyable addition to the genre. It is the kind of movie that can generate arguments after the credits. Was this character right? Was that character lying? Would you have taken the money? Who was actually trustworthy? Did the money corrupt them or did it simply reveal them? Those questions are more valuable than simply asking whether the explosions looked good. Because the best thrillers do not end when the movie ends. They continue in your head, and The Rip has enough ambiguity and moral tension to do exactly that. If you are making a YouTube video about this film, that is also where your strongest hook should focus. Do not begin by saying, "Today we are going to talk about The Rip, a 2026 Netflix movie starring Matt Damon and Ben Affleck." That sounds like a Wikipedia page. Start with the question. Imagine you are a police officer and you open a door expecting to find drugs. Instead, you find millions of dollars in cash. The money is supposed to become evidence. But then you realize something terrifying. Somebody on your own team may want to steal it. And suddenly the criminals outside are not the biggest problem anymore. That kind of opening immediately creates curiosity. Then bring in Damon and Affleck. Now add Matt Damon and Ben Affleck to that situation. Two longtime friends, two veteran actors, two police officers, and a fortune sitting between them. Then promise the audience that the movie is not simply about money. It is about trust, greed, loyalty, and what happens when you give ordinary people an extraordinary opportunity. That is the story, and that is why The Rip is worth talking about. The movie may look like another action thriller when you see the poster. But underneath the guns and money is a much older question. How well do we really know the people standing beside us? And perhaps even more frightening, how well do we really know ourselves? because most people believe they know what they would do when temptation arrives, but until the money is actually sitting in front of you, you do not really know. That is the trap the rip builds, and once you understand the trap, the entire movie becomes more interesting. The money is not simply a prize, it is a test, and every character has to decide what kind of person they are when nobody is watching. That is what makes this movie more than just another Netflix crime thriller. It is a story about what happens when trust has a price, and sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is not the one holding the gun, it is the one holding the money. The deeper you go into the rip, the more you realize that the movie is not really interested in making its characters completely innocent or completely guilty. That would be too easy. Instead, the story places them in situations where every decision has a consequence, and sometimes the difference between doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing becomes surprisingly small. A police officer can start the day believing completely in the law and finish it wondering whether the law is worth protecting when the people around him are breaking it. A partner can spend years trusting another officer and then suddenly question every conversation they ever had. That is what makes the central group so important. The money does not create all of their problems. It exposes the problems that were already hiding underneath the surface. Dane Dumars is especially interesting because he is not simply a man trying to survive. He is responsible for the entire team. That means every mistake becomes his responsibility, even when he did not personally make the mistake. Leadership sounds powerful until something goes wrong. Then leadership becomes a burden. Dumas has to make decisions quickly, protect his officers, answer to people above him, and somehow keep everyone focused while the situation becomes increasingly dangerous. Matt Damon plays that pressure in a relatively controlled way. He does not need to constantly scream or throw things around to show that the character is struggling. Sometimes the character's tired expression says more than a long speech could. That is one of the reasons Damon fits this type of role so naturally. He has spent years playing characters who appear calm even when their lives are falling apart. Whether he is playing a scientist, soldier, spy, businessman, or police officer, he often has the ability to make an ordinary conversation feel like something important is happening underneath it. In the Rip, that quality becomes particularly useful because the movie depends on uncertainty. You are constantly watching faces and listening to conversations, trying to determine whether the people in the room are saying what they actually believe. Ben Affleck brings a different energy. His character JD Byrne is not simply Dumars's second in command. He represents the complicated history behind the team. He has experience, confidence, and his own way of doing things. That creates friction because people who have worked together for years sometimes struggle when their roles change. A friendship can survive competition, but it becomes much harder when one friend suddenly has authority over the other. Affleck has played tough, emotionally guarded characters many times, and that experience works well here. Byrne does not feel like someone who explains everything he is thinking. He often keeps things inside, which makes it difficult for the audience to know exactly where his loyalty stands. That uncertainty becomes one of the film's most effective weapons. Imagine watching a scene where two characters are talking about something completely normal, but you already know there are millions of dollars nearby. Suddenly, every sentence sounds different. When someone says, we should wait, you start wondering why they want to wait. When someone says, we should move the money, you wonder where they want to move it. When somebody asks how much cash was found, you start wondering whether they are simply doing their job or calculating their options. The dialogue does not always need to be complicated because the situation itself creates the tension. This is also where the movie's pacing becomes important. The first part has to give the audience enough time to understand the relationships before everything begins collapsing. If the betrayal happened immediately, it would not have the same impact. We need to believe that these people trust one another before we can feel the damage when that trust disappears. That is why the early scenes matter more than they might seem. They establish routines, personalities, and professional relationships that later become targets. The stash house is almost like a character itself because it changes the behavior of everyone around it. Before the money is discovered, the officers have a clear mission. They are doing police work, they have a target, they have a plan. Once the cash is discovered, the mission becomes much more complicated. The money creates new possibilities, and those possibilities are dangerous. Suddenly, the officers are not only thinking about the criminals they came to arrest, they are thinking about what could happen if someone else gets the money. They are thinking about who knows. They are thinking about who can be trusted. They are thinking about what would happen if the cash disappeared. And the most dangerous thought of all is the thought that maybe nobody would ever know. That is where the rip becomes a story about temptation rather than simply corruption. Corruption is easy to understand when a character is already openly criminal. Temptation is more complicated because it gives the audience a chance to imagine themselves in the same situation. You can tell yourself that you would never steal from someone, but what if the money already belonged to criminals? What if the victims were never going to get it back? What if the system was already corrupt? What if taking a small amount felt harmless? What if everybody else was doing it? That is how moral compromises begin. Usually, people do not wake up one morning and decide to become monsters. They make one small decision, then another, and eventually they are standing somewhere they never imagined they would be. The movie's greatest strength is that it understands this psychological process. The characters do not necessarily have to announce their moral decline. Their behavior shows it, a little more secrecy here, a little more suspicion there, a conversation that ends when another officer walks into the room, a phone that suddenly becomes important, a decision that does not make sense unless there is information the audience does not know. These details create a growing sense that the team is no longer functioning as one unit, and when a police team stops trusting each other, the situation becomes incredibly dangerous. Police officers are supposed to rely on their partners because their jobs can literally depend on it. You have to believe that the person covering your back will protect you. You have to believe that the person giving you information is telling the truth. You have to believe that the person standing beside you will not suddenly become your enemy. Once that foundation disappears, every action becomes unpredictable. This is one reason the movie's action scenes feel more meaningful when they arrive. The violence is not happening between two groups of strangers, it is happening in a situation where alliances are constantly changing. Someone who was an ally 5 minutes ago might now be a threat. Someone you expected to protect you might be the person you need to protect yourself from. That uncertainty gives the action a different kind of tension. The film also benefits from not making Miami look completely glamorous. There are moments where the city feels bright, wealthy, and almost luxurious, but the characters occupy a much darker world beneath that surface. This contrast is familiar in crime cinema, but it works because Miami has always been associated with both wealth and criminal activity in popular culture. The city can look beautiful from a distance while hiding very ugly realities. That makes it a natural setting for a story about money, crime, and people who are willing to cross boundaries. The visual language of the movie also supports that idea. Instead of presenting the characters as perfect action heroes, the cinematography gives the world a harder, more grounded appearance. Police operations feel messy, buildings feel lived in. The environments are not designed simply to look cool in a trailer. They are designed to make the characters feel trapped inside a world where there is not always a clean way out. That grounded approach is important because The Rip is ultimately not a superhero movie. Nobody has unlimited abilities. Nobody can survive every bullet. Nobody can simply walk away from the consequences of their decisions. When people get hurt, the situation becomes more serious. When someone betrays another person, the relationship cannot simply reset in the next scene. The movie works best when it remembers these consequences. There is also an interesting contrast between the professional identities of the characters and their personal identities. At work, they are officers. They have titles, ranks, badges, responsibilities, and procedures. But underneath those things, they are still human beings with bills, families, fears, ambitions, and weaknesses. That is the part the money attacks. The cash does not care about their rank. It does not care about their years of service. It does not care about their reputation. It simply sits there offering possibilities. Millions of dollars can represent different things to different people. To one character, it might represent freedom. To another, it could mean revenge. To someone else, it might mean the ability to protect their family. Another person might see it as a once in a lifetime opportunity. That is why the same pile of money can produce completely different reactions. The cash itself has no morality. The morality comes from what the characters decide to do with it. This idea is one of the oldest themes in crime stories, but it remains effective because money is something almost everyone understands. You do not need to be a police officer to understand temptation. You do not need to be involved in organized crime to understand financial pressure. Everyone understands what it means to want something and not be able to afford it. Everyone understands the difference between the life they have and the life they imagine they could have. That is why the money in the rip feels almost like a fantasy at first. Millions of dollars sitting in one place can make characters imagine an entirely different future. They can imagine houses, cars, travel, security, freedom, and never having to worry about money again. But the movie gradually reminds us that money does not come alone. It brings danger with it. This is a classic crime thriller idea. Easy money is rarely actually easy. If millions of dollars are sitting inside a criminal stash house, there is a reason they are there. Someone owns that money. Someone is looking for it. Someone is willing to kill for it. And the moment the police officers take possession of it, they become part of the conflict whether they want to be or not. The movie therefore creates multiple circles of danger. There are the criminals who want their property back. There are law enforcement agencies with their own interests. There are officers inside the team who may have different ideas about what should happen. And there is the possibility that information about the money has already escaped. Every additional person who learns about the cash increases the risk. This creates a classic thriller question. Who knows what? That question is sometimes more important than who has the gun. If one character knows something another character does not, that information becomes power. If someone knows where the money is, they have power. If someone knows who took the money, they have power. If someone knows that a colleague is lying, they have power. The movie constantly moves information between characters, and that movement keeps the story alive. The best crime thrillers understand that information is a weapon. The Rip uses that principle throughout the story. A character does not always need to physically attack another character. Sometimes knowing the truth is enough to put someone in danger. And that brings us back to the partnership between Damon and Affleck. Their real life friendship becomes almost impossible for audiences to ignore. These are two actors who have known each other since their early careers, who worked together on one of the most important films of their lives, and who later built a production company together. Seeing them in a story where trust becomes increasingly fragile creates an unusual viewing experience. It almost feels like Hollywood is playing a joke on the audience. The two men who became famous for friendship are now playing men whose professional relationship is being tested by money. That does not mean the movie is actually about their real friendship. It is not. But audiences naturally make the connection, and that connection adds entertainment value. There is also something nostalgic about seeing them together again. For viewers who remember Good Will Hunting, the reunion has emotional weight. Those actors have grown older and their careers have changed dramatically. They are no longer the young stars trying to prove that they belong in Hollywood. They are now established filmmakers and producers who have enough power to create projects around the stories they want to tell. That makes the Rip part of a larger chapter in their careers. It is not simply Matt Damon and Ben Affleck star in a Netflix movie. It is also another example of Damon and Affleck using their partnership to build projects outside the traditional Hollywood system. Artist Equity was founded by Damon and Affleck with the idea of giving filmmakers and creative workers a greater connection to the financial performance of their projects. The Rip therefore fits into a broader experiment about how movies are produced and how the people who make them can participate in the rewards when those movies succeed. That business side is rarely discussed when audiences watch an action thriller, but it is actually fascinating. A movie is not just what appears on the screen. Behind every scene are hundreds or thousands of people working in departments that most viewers never think about. Camera crews, electricians, costume designers, makeup artists, production assistants, editors, sound teams, stunt performers, drivers, set designers, location managers, visual effects artists, and countless others all contribute to the final product. A movie like The Rip depends on that enormous network of people. The action scenes alone require careful planning. A gunfight may look spontaneous, but behind the camera, it can involve weeks of preparation. Actors need to know where they are standing. Camera operators need to know where they can move. Stunt performers need to understand exactly what is going to happen. Special effects teams need to coordinate explosions, gunfire, debris, and other physical effects. Editors later transform all of those pieces into a sequence that feels immediate and chaotic. That is the magic of filmmaking. The audience sees chaos, the crew creates control. This is particularly true for police action movies. A shootout that lasts 2 minutes on screen can require hours or days of work. Every bullet impact, camera movement, sound effect, and reaction has to be planned. The actors have to perform safely while making the scene look dangerous. Scott Adkins' presence is especially interesting in this context because audiences associate him strongly with physical action filmmaking. His martial arts background has made him a familiar face for action fans, and his involvement gives the movie another layer of credibility in the physical side of the genre. Even when the story is driven by Damon and Affleck, having experienced action performers around them helps the film Sam's violent moments feel more convincing. The movie also benefits from the fact that its cast does not look like a group of interchangeable action heroes. They have different physical types and different screen personalities. That makes it easier for the audience to remember who is who when the situation becomes chaotic. One of the challenges of ensemble thrillers is making sure the audience can follow the relationships. If too many characters have similar roles, the story can become confusing. The Rip solves some of that problem by giving the major characters different personalities and professional positions. Dumas is the leader, Ban is the veteran partner, Roe brings another perspective, Baptiste contributes to the group dynamic. Salazar adds another layer to the team's personal and professional tension. Lopez Molina brings her own identity into the group. And Nix represents as outside authority through the DEA. That structure creates pressure because the team is not completely isolated. There are people inside the police group and people outside it. Each side has different responsibilities and different reasons for wanting answers. This is another important theme. Institutions are made of people. When we say the police or the DEA, it can sound like one giant machine where everyone thinks the same way. Real organizations are not like that. They contain individuals with different personalities, ambitions, fears, and interpretations of their responsibilities. A crime thriller becomes more interesting when it recognizes that reality. The DEA agent played by Kyle Chandler is particularly useful because his presence changes the balance. When an outside authority enters the situation, the local team can no longer simply handle everything internally. Questions become more serious. Accountability becomes more important. Suddenly, the officers have to think not only about what happened, but about how their actions will look to someone else. And perception matters enormously in police stories. Sometimes the truth is not enough. You also need to be able to prove the truth. That is one of the reasons evidence becomes such a powerful concept in the movie. The cache is evidence, the location is evidence, the bodies are evidence, the phones are evidence, conversations are evidence. Every action can later become part of an investigation. So when someone decides to hide something, they are not simply hiding information. They are potentially creating evidence against themselves. This is where the movie's title takes on another meaning. A rip is about taking something, but every act of taking something creates a question about ownership. Who took it? Who had the right to take it? Who knows it was taken? Who can prove it? Those questions turn a simple police seizure into a much larger moral problem. The film also understands that greed is rarely satisfied. If someone takes a little money, why stop there? If they lie once, why not lie again? If they cover up one mistake, why not cover up the next one? Each decision makes the next decision easier. This creates the story's downward spiral. The characters do not simply move from good to evil. They move from certainty to uncertainty, from trust to suspicion, from cooperation to self-protection, from law enforcement to survival, and that gradual movement is much more believable than suddenly turning everyone into villains. There is also a fascinating question about whether the characters actually deserve the money. Some might argue that because the money came from criminals, taking it from them is not really theft. But that argument collapses quickly. Criminal money does not automatically become morally free. If police officers steal evidence, they are still stealing. If the justice system cannot trust the people responsible for protecting it, the entire system becomes weaker. That is why the story can be read as a warning about institutional corruption. A police badge represents authority, but authority only works when people believe it is being used responsibly. The moment an officer uses that authority for personal gain, the damage goes beyond the individual, it damages public trust, and that makes the moral stakes larger than the money itself. A few $1 million can change the life of one person. But corruption inside law enforcement can affect thousands or millions of people because it destroys the belief that the rules are being applied fairly. The movie does not need to give a long political speech about this, the situation speaks for itself. If the people who are supposed to protect the evidence cannot be trusted with the evidence, then what exactly is the system protecting? That is a question worth thinking about after the movie ends. At the same time, the rip does not become so serious that it forgets to entertain. That balance is important. A movie can have themes without turning every scene into a lecture. Kanahan keeps the story moving through action, suspense, character conflict, and dark humor. The humor is especially useful because constant tension can become exhausting. A small joke can give the audience a moment to breathe before the pressure rises again. That is also why the movie can generate memes so easily. Internet culture loves situations where ordinary human relationships collide with ridiculous amounts of money. You can imagine the memes almost instantly. Me and bro after finding $20 million, friendship test, impossible difficulty. When your partner says, don't worry, it's evidence. When the group chat discovers there is no camera. Police teamwork until someone mentions the money. And perhaps the most brutal version, money doesn't change people. It just gives them permission. That line basically summarizes the entire psychological idea of the film. The movie also has meme potential because Damon and Affleck's expressions are recognizable. A single screenshot can become a reaction image. A serious stare can become a joke about someone checking the restaurant bill. A suspicious look can become a meme about your friend saying, "Trust me." That is one of the strange ways movies live beyond the screen now. A film can have a serious theme, but the internet will turn one facial expression into a joke within hours, and sometimes that actually helps the movie. People who see the meme may not know the context, they become curious, they search for the film, they discover the trailer. They watch it, the joke becomes marketing. This is especially valuable for streaming movies because the barrier to watching is so low. You do not have to drive to a theater, you do not have to buy a ticket. If you already have Netflix, the movie is simply sitting there. That can turn online curiosity into actual viewing much faster than traditional theatrical marketing. This is one reason the release of The Rip was interesting from a business perspective. The movie had a major cast and a significant production budget, but its success was measured primarily through streaming performance rather than theatrical revenue. Netflix's reporting system means that audiences often have to look at viewing statistics and platform rankings rather than a conventional box office total. For creators discussing the movie online, that gives you another opportunity. Instead of simply saying, the movie made this much money, you can discuss how streaming success is measured differently. You can talk about viewership, you can talk about rankings, you can talk about how long the movie stayed popular. You can talk about audience reactions, you can talk about whether people finished it, you can talk about social media discussion. In the streaming era, those factors are part of the new definition of success. And that makes The Rip an interesting case study. It is an expensive adult crime thriller released globally through a streaming platform built around two major Hollywood stars, produced by their own company, and designed to attract both traditional movie fans and modern streaming audiences. That combination would have looked very different 20 years ago. A movie like this might have opened in thousands of theaters. The studio would have spent months marketing it, box office analysts would have predicted its opening weekend, audiences would have waited for Friday. Today, the same kind of movie can appear on millions of screens at once. You can watch it on a television, a laptop, a tablet, a phone, you can pause it. You can watch half today and half tomorrow. You can watch it alone at midnight. That changes the relationship between the audience and the movie. And for a tense crime thriller, there is something strangely appropriate about watching it at home in the dark. No theater audience, no distractions. Just you and a story about people who cannot trust each other. That intimate viewing experience can actually make certain scenes feel more personal. When a character looks at another character and says something suspicious, you are not sitting in a room with hundreds of people, you are sitting alone. The silence becomes part of the experience. Of course, some people will always prefer theaters because a large screen and powerful sound system make action sequences more impressive. But the RIP was designed for the streaming environment and it fits that environment well. It is long enough to feel substantial without becoming exhausting. It has recognizable stars, it has action, it has suspense, it has a simple premise, and it has enough twists and moral questions to create conversation. That is almost the perfect formula for a Netflix thriller. But the movie's real lasting value will probably depend on how audiences remember the characters rather than the individual action scenes. Explosions are forgotten. Character choices are remembered. A gunfight can be exciting for 5 minutes. A betrayal can stay in your head for days. That is why the relationship between Dumas and Byrne is so important. Their conflict represents the larger question of the film. How much pressure can a relationship survive? Friendship can survive disagreement. Professional relationships can survive stress, but can either survive millions of dollars? That is the experiment. And the answer is not simple because everyone has a different breaking point. Some people break because of greed, some because of fear, some because they believe they are protecting someone else, some because they are angry, some because they think they are smarter than everyone around them, and some people make bad decisions simply because they are trapped in a situation where every available option is terrible. That is what makes the characters human. They are not chess pieces moving through a plot. They are people reacting to pressure. Sometimes they make the right decision, sometimes they make the wrong one. Sometimes they make a decision that seems right at first but creates an even bigger problem later. That is how real life works, and that is why the movie's best moments feel believable. The audience may not agree with a character's decision, but they can understand why the character made it. That distinction is important. A believable character does not have to make good decisions, they just have to make understandable decisions. The rip is strongest when it follows that rule. The film also raises questions about masculinity and professional pride. These are men and women working in an environment where showing weakness can be dangerous. Police officers are expected to be confident. They are expected to control situations. They are expected to make decisions under pressure. But when everyone is scared and nobody knows who to trust, maintaining that image becomes difficult. A character might pretend to be calm because admitting fear could make them look weak. Someone might become aggressive because they are trying to hide uncertainty. Someone might refuse help because accepting help would mean admitting that they have lost control. These psychological reactions make the team dynamic more complicated. And the presence of money makes those emotions even stronger. Money does not just create greed, it creates insecurity. If one person thinks another person might take the money, they have to protect themselves. If another person suspects the same thing, they have to protect themselves too. Soon everyone is protecting themselves, and once everyone is protecting themselves, nobody is protecting the team. That is how trust collapses. One of the most effective ways to understand the movie is to imagine the team as a glass structure. At the beginning, it looks strong, then the money appears, one crack develops, then another. Nobody notices the first crack because it is tiny. But every decision adds pressure. Eventually, the entire structure begins to break. That is the rip in a single image. A team does not have to be destroyed by one massive betrayal. Sometimes it is destroyed by dozens of small doubts. And that is why the movie can feel tense even during quiet scenes. You are waiting for the next crack. You are waiting for someone to make a mistake. You are waiting for someone to reveal too much. You are waiting for the money to change the balance. And eventually, the question becomes impossible to avoid: who will be the first person to cross the line? Once that line is crossed, there is no going back. The story then becomes about consequences. And consequences are what separate a decent crime thriller from a memorable one. If characters can betray each other and nothing happens, the story feels meaningless. But when every decision changes the situation, the audience becomes invested. That is where the movie earns its tension. You start thinking ahead, you start predicting what someone might do. You start wondering whether your prediction is wrong. And when the movie surprises you, it works because you are actively participating in the story. That is the best kind of thriller. It does not simply tell you what happened, it makes you try to figure out what will happen. And even if you guess correctly, you can still enjoy the journey because the characters make the experience worthwhile. This is also why the movie has strong potential for YouTube discussions. A good review should not simply repeat the plot. It should ask questions: was Dumas right? Was Byrne trustworthy? Did the money actually corrupt the team? Which character had the strongest moral position? Was the ending satisfying? Did the movie successfully balance action and character drama? Was Damon and Affleck's chemistry enough to carry the story? Did the film feel like an old school crime thriller or a modern Netflix action movie? These questions create discussion, and discussion creates engagement. If you are presenting the movie in a video, one of the strongest techniques is to make the audience choose sides. Ask them: if you found $20 million in a stash house and knew the money belonged to criminals, would you turn every dollar over to the police? That question alone can create a comment section. Some people will say yes, some will say no, some will say they would take a small amount, some will joke that they would disappear. And some will say that they would never touch it because they know exactly how dangerous it would be. That is the beauty of the premise. It allows the audience to imagine themselves inside the story. And once viewers imagine themselves inside the story, they become more emotionally invested. That is why the movie's hook should never be only about the actors. Matt Damon and Ben Affleck are back together is interesting, but would you steal millions if nobody could prove it? Is much more powerful. The actors get people to click, the moral question keeps them watching, the story keeps them engaged, and the ending gives them something to discuss. That is the perfect structure for a movie review video. The film also has several small details that are easy to miss if you are only watching for the action. The police terminology, the structure of the team, the professional tension, and the way authority moves between characters all contribute to the larger theme. Even the title is something that becomes more interesting after you understand its meaning. At first, The Rip sounds like a simple action title. After learning the police slang behind it, the title becomes part of the world building. It sounds like something an actual officer might say. That gives the movie a more authentic flavor. Authenticity is particularly important for crime films because audience have become very familiar with police procedures through television and movies. If everything feels fake, viewers notice. If the dialogue sounds too polished, viewers notice. If the officer behave like superheroes, viewers notice. The movie does not need to be a documentary, but it needs enough realism to make the fantasy believable. The involvement of people with real law enforcement experience in the inspiration behind the story helps with that foundation. The original Miami incident that inspired the movie demonstrates just how strange real police work can become. Reality can sometimes provide a premise that sounds too unbelievable for fiction. Millions of dollars hidden inside a house is already a cinematic image. Adding police officers who have to decide what to do with that discovery creates a story almost automatically. That is one of the reasons the real life inspiration is such an interesting fact to mention in a video. You can tell your audience. The crazy part is that the basic idea did not come entirely from someone's imagination. The filmmakers were inspired by a real Miami police cash seizure. That immediately makes the story more intriguing. Then you can ask, if something like this can happen in real life, how would you react if you were one of the officers? That creates curiosity before you even discuss the movie. And that is the human side of the Rip. Underneath the Hollywood production, famous actors, Netflix marketing, and action sequences is a very simple human fear. What would you do if you suddenly had access to everything you ever wanted? Would you remain the same person, or would the opportunity reveal a different version of you? There is no easy answer, and perhaps that is exactly why crime stories never disappear. People are fascinated by the moment when ordinary life breaks. One decision changes everything, one secret becomes dangerous, one opportunity becomes a temptation. One lie creates another lie. One betrayal destroys years of trust. The Rip takes all of those ideas and puts them inside one increasingly dangerous situation. It is not perfect. It does not completely reinvent the genre. Some viewers will find certain elements familiar. Some will prefer the character driven tension of the earlier sections to the larger action sequences later. Others will love the escalation. But as a modern crime thriller, it has a strong foundation. The cast is one of its biggest assets. The premise is immediately understandable. The moral questions are universal. The action gives the movie commercial energy. The relationship between Damon and Affleck gives it extra curiosity. And the Netflix release makes it accessible to a massive global audience. Perhaps the biggest compliment you can give the film is that it knows exactly what kind of movie it wants to be. It wants to be tense, it wants to be violent, it wants to be entertaining, it wants to make you suspicious of everyone, and it wants you to ask yourself what you would do. That is enough. Not every movie needs to become a masterpiece to be worth watching. Sometimes a movie succeeds simply by creating 2 hours where you forget about everything else and become invested in a group of people making increasingly dangerous decisions. The Rip does that, and when the credits begin, the most interesting question may not be whether the movie was realistic or whether every twist worked. The most interesting question may be the one you were asking before the final act: what would I have done? Because if your answer changed during the movie, then the film has already accomplished something. At the beginning, the money looks like an opportunity, then it looks like a threat, then it becomes a test, and finally, it becomes a mirror. A mirror showing every character what they are capable of. That is why the movie's central idea works so well. Money does not have to speak, it does not have to move, it does not have to threaten anyone, it just has to be there. People will do the rest. And perhaps that is the most frightening part of the Rip. The danger is not the money. The danger is what people are willing to do for it. There is another way to look at the Rip that makes the entire story even more interesting. The movie can be seen as a test of loyalty. Every member of the team has a professional duty, but professional duty is not always the same thing as personal loyalty. If your best friend at work asks you to do something that could destroy your career, what do you choose? Do you protect your friend because you have years of history together, or do you protect yourself because you know the consequences could follow you for the rest of your life? That conflict is what gives the story emotional weight. The characters are not simply deciding what is legal, they are deciding who they are loyal to. Sometimes those two things are completely different. This is particularly important for a movie built around police officer because the idea of loyalty is complicated in all law enforcement. Officers are trained to work as teams. They depend on each other in dangerous situations. They have to know that another person will be there when things go wrong. That kind of trust is not built in one day. It can take years of shared experiences to create it. But the same history that creates trust can also make betrayal more painful. If a stranger lies to you, you might be angry. If the person who has saved your life lies to you, it can feel like your entire understanding of the relationship has been destroyed. The Rip understands that emotional difference. That is also why the casting of Damon and Affleck feels almost perfect for this particular story. Their real life friendship adds an unusual layer to the fictional relationship. Audiences know these two men have worked together for decades, so watching them play characters whose trust is placed under pressure naturally creates curiosity. Even when the movie is not directly referencing their real lives, the audience brings that history into the room. It makes every argument feel slightly more interesting because viewers already know the actors have a long creative relationship outside the story. There is also a certain maturity to seeing Damon and Affleck in these roles. They are not playing young men who are discovering the world for the first time. They are playing experienced professionals who have already lived through years of difficult situations. That means the conflict is not about becoming adults. It is about what happens when adults who believe they understand themselves are placed in circumstances that reveal another side of their personalities. That is much more interesting than simply watching inexperienced characters make obvious mistakes. Damon's character carries the weight of leadership, while Affleck's character carries the weight of history. That distinction creates a natural source of tension. Leadership requires decisions. History creates expectations. If Dumas makes a decision that Byrne does not agree with, the disagreement is not simply about that moment. It is connected to everything that happened before. Every old argument, every previous success, every sacrifice, and every unresolved problem can suddenly become relevant. That is how a relationship becomes complicated without the screenplay needing to explain every detail. The movie also understands the importance of silence. In many action films, characters talk constantly because the writers are afraid the audience will become bored. The rip benefits when it allows moments to breathe. A character can look at another character without speaking. A person can enter a room and immediately change the mood. Someone can pause before answering a question. Those small moments are valuable because they give the audience space to become suspicious on their own. Suspicion is one of the most powerful emotions in a thriller because it makes the audience work. Once you suspect a character, you start searching for evidence. Every later scene becomes part of the investigation. You are no longer simply watching the movie, you are testing your own theory against what you see. If the theory is confirmed, you feel clever. If the theory is wrong, you feel surprised. Either way, you are engaged. That is why spoilers can be especially damaging to a film like this. If you already know every major betrayal, discovery, and turning point, some of the tension disappears. The movie can still be enjoyable because of the performances and action, but the experience changes. The first viewing is about uncertainty, a second viewing is about noticing clues. Those are two very different experiences. A second viewing of The Rip can actually be interesting because you already know where the story is going. You begin noticing small details that may have seemed meaningless the first time. A character's reaction to a particular conversation may suddenly look different. A line that sounded casual can take on another meaning. A decision that seemed strange may make more sense once you understand the character's motivation. That is often a sign of a decent thriller. It gives you enough information that the story can be interpreted differently after you know the outcome. The movie also benefits from the fact that it does not need a giant mythology. There are no complicated fictional universes to explain. There is no need to remember 10 characters from previous movies. The situation is immediate. These people are dealing with money, criminals, authority, and each other. That simplicity makes the film accessible to people who may not normally watch crime thrillers. This accessibility is especially important for Netflix. A streaming platform needs movies that can appeal to different audiences simultaneously. A person might click because of Matt Damon, another might click because of Ben Affleck, someone else might recognize Yeun, an action fan might notice Scott Adkins, a crime thriller fan might see Joe Carnahan's name. Each person arrives for a different reason, but they end up watching the same movie. That is a smart casting strategy because recognizable actors reduce the risk of asking an audience to invest in an unfamiliar story. If the premise were presented with unknown actors, some viewers might scroll past it. Put Damon and Affleck on the poster, and suddenly the same premise feels like an event. The cast becomes part of the marketing. The movie also represents an interesting stage in the careers of its stars. Damon has spent decades moving between blockbuster entertainment, serious drama, comedy, science fiction, and independent style projects. Affleck has moved between acting, directing, writing, producing, and major franchise roles. Their partnership has evolved from two young writers trying to make it in Hollywood into a production relationship with the ability to develop and finance projects themselves. The Rip is therefore not just another acting job, it is part of a larger creative partnership. Artist equity is particularly relevant here because the company has positioned itself around creator focused filmmaking and alternative approaches to compensation. The idea that people working on a film could participate in performance based bonuses is especially interesting in the streaming era. Traditional Hollywood workers have historically had clearer relationships with theatrical success because box office performance is publicly visible. Streaming makes that much harder to understand from the outside. A movie can be extremely popular without anyone outside the platform knowing exactly how much revenue it generated. That creates a strange situation for viewers. We are used to asking whether a movie was a hit by looking at box office numbers. With the RIP, the better questions involve streaming performance and audience engagement. Did people watch it? Did they finish it? Did they recommend it? Did it stay popular after release? Did it become one of the platform's most watched titles? Did people keep talking about it? These things matter more in the streaming economy than the traditional opening weekend figure. And this is where the idea of box office becomes almost funny when discussing a Netflix movie. You could make a video titled, "How much money did the Rip make?" And the answer would immediately become more complicated than viewers expect. There is no conventional worldwide theatrical total to point at in the same way there would be for a major cinema release. Instead, the movie's performance has to be discussed in the context of its streaming distribution. That itself could become an interesting section of a YouTube video. You could explain that the film had the scale of a major Hollywood thriller but followed a modern streaming release model. The audience does not buy individual tickets. Instead, the movie becomes part of a subscription service. That means the economics are completely different. A single viewer watching the movie does not generate a separate ticket sale, but their viewing contributes to the platform's engagement and the overall value of the service. This is one of the biggest changes happening in the movie business, and The Rip is a useful example because it looks like a traditional studio thriller while behaving like a streaming product. That combination is becoming increasingly common. Theatrical movies need to convince audiences to leave home. Streaming movies need to convince audiences to stop scrolling. Those are two completely different marketing battles. A theater poster might promise spectacle, a streaming thumbnail has to promise curiosity. That is why the image of Damon and Affleck, combined with the idea of millions of dollars and a team that cannot trust one another, is so effective. It gives you an immediate reason to click. The movie's title also works well in this environment because it is short and memorable. The Rip sounds aggressive. It suggests crime, violence, theft, and danger without explaining everything. A short title is easier to remember and easier to use in social media posts. That matters in an era where movies compete not only against other movies but against videos, games, social media, television shows, and endless online content. The challenge for The Rip is therefore not simply making the movie good. It is making people care enough to press play. Once they press play, the movie has to hold their attention. That is where the opening becomes important. A strong thriller opening does not need to explain everything. It needs to create a question. Who are these people? What are they doing? What are they about to discover? Why does this situation feel dangerous? The earlier the movie gives the audience a question they want answered, the easier it becomes to keep watching. Once the cash enters the story, the question changes from what are they going to find to what are they going to do with it. That is a strong transition because it changes the source of suspense. At first, the danger is external. Then the danger becomes internal. That is one of the most effective structural ideas in the movie. External danger is easy to understand. Criminals are coming, weapons are involved, people are being threatened. But internal danger is more difficult because it comes from people you thought were allies. That uncertainty can be more frightening than a traditional villain. A villain outside the group can be identified, a traitor inside the group cannot be trusted. And if you do not know who the traitor is, everyone becomes suspicious. That is exactly the atmosphere the film wants. The characters begin to question each other, and the audience begins questioning them too. Every relationship becomes part of the mystery. You start wondering who is protecting whom. You start wondering whether someone is telling the complete truth. You start wondering whether an apparently innocent decision has another explanation. This is where the movie's dialogue becomes important. The strongest lines are not necessarily the ones that sound impressive, they are the ones that reveal character. A person who refuses to answer a simple question can tell you something. A person who changes the subject can tell you something. A person who becomes angry when challenged can tell you something. In a thriller, conversation is evidence. The film also uses physical spaces to create tension. A room can become dangerous simply because too many people know what is inside it. A vehicle can become a trap. A hallway can become a place where someone is suddenly exposed. A house can feel safe at one moment and completely unsafe a few minutes later. This is one reason the production design matters more than audiences might realize. Crime thrillers often rely on locations that feel authentic rather than overly designed. The environment should look like places where people actually live, work, hide, or conduct criminal business. When the environment feels believable, the danger feels more believable too. The same applies to costumes. Police officers have a recognizable visual identity, but the movie does not need to make them look like action figures. They should look like working professionals. That realism helps ground the more dramatic moments. If the characters look too perfect, the movie starts feeling artificial. If they look tired, stressed, and practical, the audience accepts the world more easily. The performances work in the same way. Damon and Affleck are stars, but the movie benefits when they disappear into their roles rather than constantly reminding viewers that they are celebrities. The best scenes are the ones where you stop thinking that is Matt Damon and start thinking that is a police officer who is worried about what happens next. That transformation is one of the most important skills an actor has, and it is particularly difficult when the actor is famous. The more recognizable the actor, the harder it can be to forget the celebrity. But Damon has enough experience to make the character feel grounded. Affleck has a similar advantage. Their familiarity becomes a strength during the emotional scenes because the audience already understands their screen presence. Steven Yeun provides another interesting contrast because his career has moved across drama, comedy, action, and genre projects. He can make a character feel intelligent without making him appear overly theatrical. In a movie filled with people trying to control a situation, subtle intelligence becomes valuable. Teyana Taylor's presence also helps broaden the ensemble. She brings a different energy to the team and helps prevent the story from becoming exclusively about two older male stars. That matters because a police team should feel like a real group of people with different personalities rather than a collection of characters designed only to support the hero. Catalina Sandino Moreno also contributes to that ensemble dynamic, while Sasha Kale brings another perspective into the group. These characters help make the world feel larger than the central Damon Affleck relationship. Kyle Chandler's role is useful for another reason. His presence represents authority outside the immediate team. When someone arrives from another agency or another level of command, the main characters can no longer simply decide among themselves what happens next. Suddenly, there are questions about procedure, accountability, and jurisdiction. Those concepts may sound boring, but in a thriller, they create pressure. If someone wants to keep something secret, the last thing they need is another authority figure asking questions. That is why the arrival or involvement of outside investigators can change the entire atmosphere. The characters become more careful. Their stories need to match. Their explanations need to make sense. Their actions become evidence, and suddenly, even a small inconsistency can become dangerous. This is where the movie's procedural side becomes useful. It gives the characters rules that they are tempted to break. A story about criminals breaking rules is expected. A story about police officers breaking rules is more uncomfortable because they are supposed to enforce those rules. That is why the movie's morality works better when the characters are not portrayed as cartoonishly corrupt. If everyone is obviously evil from the beginning, the audience has nothing to debate. But if the characters are believable professionals who gradually find themselves in morally complicated situations, the story becomes much more interesting. One of the biggest questions the film leaves hanging over the characters is whether good intentions can justify bad actions. Suppose someone takes money because they believe the criminals will never get it back anyway. Suppose someone lies because they think they are protecting their partner. Suppose someone hides evidence because revealing it could get an innocent person killed. Suppose someone breaks the law because they believe the law itself is failing. At what point does a person stop being a protector and become part of the problem? There is no universal answer. That is why crime stories are so useful. They allow us to explore moral questions in extreme situations. Most people will never discover millions of dollars inside a criminal stash house, but almost everyone has experienced smaller versions of the same problem. You know you should tell the truth, but telling the truth could hurt someone. You know you should admit a mistake, but admitting it could create consequences. You know you should follow the rules, but breaking them might make your life easier. The stakes are smaller, but the psychological mechanism is the same. That is what makes the rip relatable despite its extreme circumstances. It exaggerates the situation but not the underlying emotions. Greed is real, fear is real, loyalty is real, jealousy is real, professional pressure is real. The desire for a better life is real, the fear of losing everything is real. Put all of the emotions in one room and you have a thriller. The movie's violence then becomes the physical expression of those emotional conflicts. When people can no longer solve their problems through conversation, violence becomes the next step. That does not mean violence is always the best part of the movie. In fact, some viewers may find that the psychological tension is stronger than the later action. That is a common issue with crime thrillers. The first half creates a fascinating moral problem, and the second half sometimes feels obligated to turn that problem into a conventional action climax. But there is also a reason filmmakers do this. A thriller needs escalation. If the entire movie consisted of people quietly arguing about money, it could become repetitive. The danger has to grow. The consequences have to become more serious. The characters have to reach a point where they cannot simply walk away. That is what the action is supposed to accomplish. It takes the psychological conflict and makes it physical. Instead of asking, "Who can I trust?" the characters eventually have to ask, "Who is going to survive?" That is a much more immediate question. The transition from suspicion to survival is where the movie's action becomes important. Gunfire, chases, confrontations, and physical danger are not simply there to entertain the audience, they represent the consequences of everything that came before. That is why the best action sequences are connected to character decisions. A chase should happen because someone made a choice, a confrontation should happen because someone betrayed someone else. A shootout should happen because communication has failed. When action grows naturally from character decisions, it feels satisfying. When action appears only because the movie needs an action scene, it can feel artificial. The Rip generally tries to connect its action to the larger conflict, which helps maintain the story's sense of purpose. The film also benefits from its R rating because the violence can feel more consequential. The audience knows this is not going to be a completely sanitized police adventure. The characters exist in a world where bad decisions can have brutal results. That allows the filmmakers to create a more serious atmosphere. Language also contributes to the authenticity. Real people do not always speak in perfectly polished sentences, especially when they are stressed or angry. Crime movies have traditionally used strong language to communicate emotional intensity, and The Rip follows that tradition. The danger of an R rated crime thriller, however, is that violence and profanity can become routine. If every scene is aggressive, nothing feels aggressive anymore. Contrast is important. A quiet conversation can make the next violent moment more powerful. A joke can make a serious argument more uncomfortable. A moment of kindness can make later betrayal hurt more. That is why the movie's quieter moments deserve attention. The audience needs time to remember that these are human beings. Without those moments, the film would become a series of action scenes connected by plot. With them, the action has emotional consequences. That is the difference between watching people fight and caring about what happens to them, and perhaps the most effective thing the Rip does is make the audience question their own assumptions. At first, you may decide who the trustworthy character is. Then something changes. You may think you know who wants the money. Then something else happens. You may think a character is acting selfishly. Then you learn their motivation. You may think another character is completely innocent. Then you discover that innocence is more complicated than it seemed. This constant adjustment is what makes a thriller engaging. It also makes the movie perfect for post watch conversations. Two people can watch the same film and come away with completely different interpretations of a character. One viewer might think a character was justified, another might think that character was clearly corrupt. One person might see the ending as satisfying, another might think it was too predictable. That is not necessarily a weakness. Sometimes disagreement is evidence that a movie has given the audience something to discuss. A completely forgettable movie produces one reaction. Okay. A movie that creates arguments is more valuable. The Rip has that potential because its central moral question does not have an easy answer. And if you are making a video about it, you should use that. Do not tell your viewers what they are supposed to think immediately. Ask them what they think, for example. Was the money the real villain of the movie, or did the money simply reveal the real villains? That is a much stronger discussion point than simply saying the movie is about corruption. Another strong question is, could you trust your best friend if $20 million was sitting between you? That question connects the movie directly to the audience. And another, would you rather have $20 million and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, or walk away and keep your freedom? Now the movie becomes personal. That is how you turn a review into a conversation. You can also discuss the Damon Affleck reunion. After decades of friendship and collaboration, seeing them together in a story about loyalty and betrayal almost feels deliberately ironic. Their real relationship becomes part of the movie's marketing without needing to be part of the plot. It is also worth remembering how unusual their career journey has been. They went from young writers who were not yet guaranteed Hollywood careers to Academy Award winning filmmakers and major stars. Their friendship survived the pressures of fame, and now they are using their combined experience to produce projects through their own company. That background makes The Rip more than just another cast announcement, it becomes another chapter in their professional partnership. And that is one of the reasons people may remember the movie even if they do not consider it a perfect thriller. They will remember Damon and Affleck together. They will remember the money. They will remember the paranoia. They will remember the question of who could be trusted, and they will probably remember at least one meme. That is how modern movies become part of popular culture. Sometimes it is not the entire film that becomes famous, sometimes it is one scene. One line, one facial expression, one relationship, one argument, one ridiculous situation. In the case of The Rip, the phrase millions of dollars and nobody can trust anybody is basically a meme factory. You can imagine a short video showing two friends looking at each other after discovering money, followed by the caption, friendship was going great until the evidence room opened. Another could say, when your best friend says, we should probably count it again. Another, me realizing my coworker knows exactly how much money is missing. The serious thriller becomes comedy because the premise is so extreme, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. Internet culture often gives movies a second audience. People may first encounter the film through a meme rather than a trailer. Then they watch the movie and discover that the original scene was actually serious. This cycle has become normal. Movies are now discussed simultaneously by critics, fans, meme pages, YouTubers, TikTok creators, and casual viewers. That creates a much larger conversation than traditional reviews alone. And The Rip is particularly suited to that environment because its central concept is easy to understand in one sentence. Police find millions, trust disappears. That is a strong social media premise. The movie also has enough star power to generate headlines. Damon and Affleck together again is already news. At Steven Yeun, Tiana Taylor, Kyle Chandler, Catalina Sandino Moreno, Sasha Calle, and Scott Adkins, and suddenly the film has a surprisingly strong ensemble. This is another reason the movie deserves more attention than simply calling it another Netflix action movie. The production brings together people from different corners of Hollywood. There are established dramatic actors, action specialists, musicians, and performers crossing into acting, experienced filmmakers, a major streaming platform, a producer led studio, and a director known for crime and action. All of those ingredients create a movie that sits between traditional Hollywood and modern streaming culture. That is perhaps the most interesting thing about The Rip outside the story itself. It represents where adult action movies are going. For years, Hollywood became increasingly dependent on giant franchises and expensive intellectual properties. Original crime thrillers became harder to finance at the highest level because studios often preferred recognizable brands. Streaming platforms changed that equation by allowing original adult movies to reach huge audiences without depending entirely on theatrical ticket sales. The Rip is exactly the type of project that benefits from that system. It does not need a superhero, it does not need a comic book logo, it does not need a sequel. It simply needs a good premise and recognizable actors. That can be refreshing. There is something satisfying about watching a movie where the biggest mystery is not how it connects to another franchise. The characters do not need to save the world, they just need to survive the night, and sometimes that is enough. The movie's limited scope can actually make the stakes feel more immediate. The world is not ending, a city is not being destroyed, an alien invasion is not coming, there are no magical objects, there is just money, people, and consequences. That makes the danger feel closer to reality. And because the basic premise is believable, the audience can imagine the situation happening. That is always a powerful quality in a thriller. You can watch a superhero fight a monster and enjoy it. But you cannot easily imagine yourself in that situation. You can watch a police team discover millions in a house and immediately imagine what the temptation would feel like. That difference matters. The movie's strongest psychological weapon is therefore its realism of temptation. Most people understand wanting money, most people understand wanting security, most people understand wanting to escape financial stress. The movie simply turns those desires up to an extreme level, and that is why the title remains so effective. The rip is not only the seizure of criminal property. It is the moment where the characters begin ripping apart the rules that previously held them together. It is the moment where professional loyalty starts competing with personal interest. It is the moment where trust becomes negotiable. It is the moment where the team stops being a team, and once that happens, the movie becomes a race to see what remains when the money is gone. Because money can disappear, people can die, evidence can be destroyed, but decisions cannot be undone. That is the final lesson of the story. Every character has to live with what they chose, and that is where the movie's emotional impact comes from. You can lose money and earn it again. You can lose a job and find another. You can lose status and rebuild it, but once you betray someone who trusted you, the relationship may never be the same. That is much harder to repair. The most dangerous thing in the rip is therefore not the cash. It is the moment someone decides that the cash is worth more than the relationship. Once that calculation is made, everything else follows. The movie becomes a chain reaction. One decision creates another, one secret creates another. One lie requires another lie, one betrayal creates the need for another betrayal, and eventually the characters are no longer trying to protect themselves from the original criminals. They are trying to protect themselves from the people standing next to them. That is when the movie reaches its most interesting territory. The enemy is no longer outside the building, the enemy is inside the group. And once you realize that, every scene feels different, every handshake can be suspicious, every conversation can contain a hidden motive, every act of kindness can be questioned, even loyalty becomes suspicious because you start wondering why someone is being loyal. Is it genuine? Is it strategic? Or they protecting their friend? Or they protecting themselves? Or they buying time? The movie keeps that uncertainty alive for much of its story, and that is why the central premise works. It is simple enough to understand immediately but complicated enough to sustain an entire thriller. That is the sweet spot. And if you are reviewing the movie, this is where your conclusion should eventually return, not to the guns, not to the money, not even to the stars. Return to the question, what would you do? Because that is what makes the rip more than an action movie. It turns the audience into another member of the team. You are watching the money, you are watching the characters. You are judging their decisions, you are wondering who you would trust. And whether you realize it or not, you are judging yourself. Maybe you would walk away, maybe you would take the money. Maybe you would tell yourself that you were only borrowing it. Maybe you would convince yourself that criminals do not deserve it. Maybe you would tell yourself that everyone else is corrupt anyway. And that is how temptation works. It does not always sound evil. Sometimes it sounds reasonable, sometimes it sounds practical, sometimes it sounds like the only option. That is what makes it dangerous, and that is why the rip can stay in your mind after the credits. The movie is ultimately asking a very old question in a very modern package. How much does it take to buy a person's loyalty? Maybe the answer is not a number, maybe the answer is simply enough money, enough pressure, enough fear, enough opportunity. And once you find that amount, you discover something about the person you thought you knew. That is the real story underneath the action. That is why the Damon and Affleck reunion works. That is why the stash house premise works. That is why the Miami setting works. That is why the crime thriller influences work. And that is why the movie has something worth discussing even after the shooting stops. The Rip may not completely reinvent the crime genre, but it understands one of the genre's most important truths. People are often more dangerous when they believe they have something to lose. Give them nothing and they may follow the rules. Give them everything and suddenly the rules become negotiable. Put millions of dollars in front of them, surround them with people they trust, remove the certainty that anyone is watching, and you have the perfect recipe for chaos. That is the experiment at the heart of the rip. And the most uncomfortable part is that the experiment does not require fictional monsters, it only requires human beings. The final stretch of the rip becomes even more interesting when you stop looking at it simply as a story about a stolen fortune and start looking at it as a story about consequences. The money is the object that everyone wants, but the real story is what happens to people after they make choices around it. At the beginning, the characters still have the luxury of believing that everything can be fixed. They can follow procedure, they can call for backup, they can report what happened, they can put the cash into evidence and go home. But every time someone chooses a different path, those options become smaller. The story gradually removes the easy exits until the characters are left with decisions that could permanently change their lives. That progression is what gives the movie its sense of inevitability. You know that the situation cannot remain stable forever. A huge amount of criminal money cannot simply sit in the middle of a police operation without causing problems. Someone will want it. Someone will be afraid of losing it. Someone will make a mistake. Someone will become suspicious. The question is not whether everything will fall apart. The question is how far it will fall before anyone can stop it. That is a very effective structure for a crime thriller because it creates tension even when nothing dramatic is happening on screen. One of the most interesting aspects of the film is the way it treats control. Every character wants control over something. Doomers wants control over his team and the operation. Byrne wants control over his own position and his relationship with Doomers. Other members of the team want control over their personal safety and their future. Outside authorities want control over the investigation. Criminals want control over their money. Once everyone wants control at the same time, conflict becomes unavoidable. There simply is not enough control to go around. This also explains why the money becomes such a powerful object. Money represents control. If you have millions of dollars, you can theoretically control where you live, what you buy, who you help, and what risks you can take. For someone who has spent years living paycheck to paycheck, that kind of freedom can be almost impossible to imagine. The movie understands that the fantasy of money can be more powerful than the money itself. The characters are not only looking at cash, they are looking at possible futures. One character might see a house, another might see freedom, another might see a way to protect a family member, another might revenge, another might simply see an opportunity to stop working forever. That difference is important because it prevents the money from having one universal meaning. It becomes a mirror. The cash reveals what each person wants most. That is a classic storytelling technique, but it works because it is simple. Give people a powerful object and watch how they react. The object does not need to have magical powers. It only needs to represent something they desperately want. In the rip, the money represents the possibility of escape, and escape is one of the strongest motivations a human being can have. The characters are trapped by their jobs, their responsibilities, their past decisions, and their relationships. The money seems to offer a door out, but the door has a price. The more they move toward it, the more dangerous the consequences become. This creates a powerful contradiction. The thing that appears to offer freedom becomes the thing that traps them. That is one of the reasons the film can be interpreted as a tragedy disguised as a thriller. The characters think they are moving toward freedom, but they are actually becoming prisoners of their own choices. Once a secret exists, they have to protect the secret. Once someone lies, they have to protect the lie. Once someone betrays a partner, they have to protect themselves from the consequences of that betrayal. Every decision creates another obligation. This is why the story can be compared to a snowball rolling downhill. At first, the problem is small, then it grows, then it becomes impossible to stop. The characters are not necessarily evil people making evil choices. They are people making choices that seem manageable in the moment. The problem is that the consequences accumulate. That is a very human idea. Most people have experienced some version of it, even if the stakes were much smaller. You make one excuse, then you need another excuse to support the first one. You hide one mistake, then you have to hide the evidence of the mistake. You tell one small lie, then another person asks a question, so you tell another lie. Eventually, the original decision has created a situation much larger than anything you expected. The difference in the rip is that the consequences involve millions of dollars, criminals, police officers, weapons, and life threatening danger. That escalation gives the film its entertainment value, but the emotional mechanism remains recognizable. Another reason the film works is that it understands the importance of professional reputation. For police officers, reputation can be almost as valuable as money. Your colleagues need to trust you. Your supervisors need to believe you. Your family needs to believe you. The public needs to believe you. Once that reputation disappears, rebuilding it can be nearly impossible. That creates an interesting conflict between short term and long term thinking. Taking the money might provide immediate financial freedom, but if you are caught, you could lose your career, your freedom, your relationships, and your reputation. The characters therefore have to calculate risk. How much is the money worth? How likely is it that they will be caught? Who knows who might talk? Who can be trusted? What evidence exists? What happens if someone changes their mind? The movie turns these questions into psychological pressure. And that is where the characters become more interesting than the plot itself. A good crime thriller does not simply ask what happens next, it asks what would this person do next. Those are different questions. The first is about plot. The second is about character. The rip is strongest when it focuses on the second because if you understand the characters, you can predict what they might do. And if the film then surprises you, the surprise feels meaningful because it challenges your understanding of that person. This is particularly true for Dumas and Byrne. Their history means that every disagreement contains more information than the immediate conversation. A disagreement about procedure can also be a disagreement about respect. A disagreement about leadership can also be a disagreement about years of friendship. A disagreement about the money can also be a question of loyalty. That layering is what makes their scenes worth watching carefully. Matt Damon and Ben Affleck have enough chemistry that even simple conversations can carry weight. They do not have to explain their entire relationship to the audience. Their familiarity with one another's acting styles helps create a natural rhythm. There is a sense that these characters know how the other person thinks, which makes their conflict more frustrating. When you know someone well, you also know exactly how to hurt them. That is one of the darker truths of close relationships. A stranger may not know where your weaknesses are, a longtime friend does. And in a story about betrayal, that knowledge becomes dangerous. The movie therefore explores a strange paradox. The people who know you best are also the people who can potentially hurt you the most. That is why betrayal is so painful. It is not simply the action itself. It is the realization that someone you trusted had enough knowledge to understand exactly what they were doing. This is why the film's title can also be interpreted emotionally. The team is being ripped apart from the inside. The money creates the initial pressure, but the real damage comes from the decisions the characters make in response to it. That makes the movie's moral center more complicated than a simple greed is bad message. Of course, greed is dangerous. But the film also shows fear of losing a career, fear of being betrayed, fear of being arrested, fear of being killed, fear of disappointing someone, fear of losing control. Fear can make people do things that they would never do under normal circumstances. Sometimes a person lies because they want money. Sometimes they lie because they are afraid someone else will take the money. Sometimes they lie because they think the truth will get someone killed. The action may look identical from the outside, but the motivation can be completely different. That is why judging the characters becomes difficult. And that is exactly where the audience gets involved. You are forced to decide which motivations you accept and which ones you reject. You may forgive one character because you understand why they acted. You may hate another character because their decision feels selfish. Someone else watching the same movie may feel the opposite. That is a good thing. It means the characters have enough complexity to produce different interpretations. The movie also works because it does not make the criminals completely irrelevant. Even though the internal police conflict becomes the main source of tension, the external criminal threat keeps the pressure high. The officers cannot simply stop and have a philosophical conversation about morality. They still have to deal with people who want the money back. That creates a ticking clock. The longer the team argues, the more dangerous the outside situation becomes. The more time they spend worrying about each other, the less attention they can give to the external threat. The two conflicts therefore feed each other. Eternal distrust makes the team weaker.